foreign direct investment in China. So over the past few weeks, our team has been researching about the financial services industry in China, and we researched the topics listed on the slide over the past few weeks, and afterwards we decided to focus on foreign direct investment, or FDI, in China for our final project. So our guiding research question was, over the next 2 years, what role will FDI play in the future of the Chinese economy, specifically with regard to Chinese financial services? So what does this mean exactly? So basically, we assessed if FDI in the financial service industry in China will play a positive or negative role in the overall growth of the Chinese economy. And we wanted to use a shorter time horizon so that would decrease our chances of inaccuracy. So just to clarify, foreign direct investment, or FDI, is classified as when foreign firms buy a majority stake in another firm. So FDI wouldn't be, for example, let's say if Grania was super impressed with Spotify this year after seeing her Spotify Wrapped and wanted to buy stock in the Swedish-based company through Robinhood. So that would not be considered FDI because that's retail investing. Instead, let's say GMT as a whole, as an organization, wanted to buy a majority stake in Spotify, that would be considered FDI. Next, after we decided on our research question, we broke down the topic of FDI in China into different research divisions, as listed on the screen, to get a more detailed, holistic picture of this topic and its overall impact on the Chinese economy. So we used the evidence and analysis we got from researching these divisions to come to our final forecasting conclusion.
And for each of these divisions, we developed about 5 ratings on a spectrum of optimism and pessimism to overall determine what each of these divisions would contribute to our outlook for FDI. In other words, each division receives a rating that individually would determine what they contribute to our positive forecast for FDI.
Okay, so our first research division, like mentioned, is the size and scope of FDI, which covers what exactly is the shape that FDI takes in China's economy. How has it evolved over time? So if we look at this graphical summary on the left to start, right, there's rapid growth that's occurred over the past 40 years, especially since 1990, as we've seen these reformist policies enacted by paramount leaders in Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin. So these policies have really opened up the Chinese economy. And if we look at this map of China right here, it's specifically these red shaded provinces that have seen the most economic liberalization. And this is where the flow of FDI into China predominantly takes place. These are the regions of the country that see the highest standards of living and the strongest economic performance within the country. And it's no coincidence that they receive the most FDI of anywhere in China. There we go. So in addition, we take a look at technology within China. This is somewhere else that FDI has played a substantial role, is in technological growth, primarily because a significant portion of China's domestic technology is bolstered by, in fact, foreign technology. Some surveys have suggested as high as much as 80% of foreign invested enterprises have brought foreign technology to China, which helps to make the market more competitive and integrates more technological growth into the Chinese economy. And as a whole, we've seen strong, sustained GDP growth in China that's among the highest they're among the highest rates in both Asia and in the world. Significant GDP growth rate that sees the economy double time and time again at very, very high rates. And all of this combines to create a positive feedback loop of sorts, whereby you see very high investor confidence in the market, which then translates over into more FDI coming in, which further helps to grow the Chinese economy, which means more investor confidence, and so on and so forth. So for all these reasons, we've decided to give size and scope of FDI an optimistic rating based on everything that's come together in this research division.
So for this second division, economic fundamentals, which really just means fundamentals, elements of the Chinese economy that make it a good FDI candidate, There are specifically GDP, the financial sector, and the middle class that we're looking at. And we rated this division as optimistic, meaning that it overall contributes to a positive FDI forecast. So first here, everyone knows that after 2000, China's GDP has really grown pretty fast, and that's what's made it famous. But pre-2000, Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese president that Sam mentioned, his economic reforms really led and transformed and translated into GDP growth. It started pretty subtly, but then got really fast prior to 2000, which is one of the reasons that FDI dollars really flocked to China. Second portion here is the financial sector. So the story of maturation within the Chinese financial sector starts with in the 80s, with banks. At first, there was just one bank, and then banks developed, of course, under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping, to really cater to different parts of the Chinese economy. And then we fast forward to today, we see the development of the financial markets via the establishment and the development of the Shanghai Stock Exchange and the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So this little quick story really just tells and indicates how the financial sector has matured and developed into a reason as to why FDI is attractive, or China is attractive for FDI. Third, we have the middle class. In any economy, the middle class is very important to really bolstering consumer spending. In the United States, the middle class has plateaued at about 150 million people. In the EU, it's about 350 million people. But in China, growing really fast, it's at over 700 million people, meaning that just this factor alone, its raw growth and its raw size, is one of the main reasons that FDI dollars do pour into China. The third division here is policy objectives. And by this, we just mean policy goals by Beijing regarding FDI itself and using FDI as a tool. So there are two sides to this coin. First is domestic policy. And the main element for domestic policy that we need to pay attention to is something called the public-private partnership, or PPP. This is when you have the government partnering with a private firm to embark on an infrastructure project, primarily domestically speaking. And over the last 4 years, we've seen about $7 trillion of FDI funds funneled through PPPs alone in China, which is a general indicator of how successful PPPs have been at funneling FDI and using them to their best possible extent and utilizing them to the best possible efficiency. The other side of the coin here is the foreign policy side, and that's the Belt and Road Initiative primarily, or the BRI. The BRI is a large-scale infrastructure project that seeks to integrate Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. And we see that the BRI really provides a huge outlet for domestic Chinese firms, primarily SOEs, to pour investment into developing economies. And we see this via a metric here, via the GDP from Kazakhstan to Laos, which is representative of a lot of developing economies that are host countries for the BRI. You see that FDI makes up a significant portion of these countries' GDP, which is one indicator or metric as to how important FDI is for these local economies, these local developing economies that are part of the BRI. On a more broader scale, we see that the BRI is achieving a degree of regional and economic integration that makes it a pretty viable and effective tool using FDI.
So the next research division was FDI Regulation and Law, and this division got a neutral rating. So FDI regulation law is important to analyze to see if there are any factors domestically and internationally to anticipate that will either slow down or facilitate the growth of Chinese FDI in the next 2 years. So to analyze the sector, we broke it up into researching FDI outflows and inflows. FDI outflows are any investment going from China into a foreign economy, and FDI inflows are any investment coming into the Chinese economy from a foreign investor. So FDI outflows doesn't have a good look in the next 2 years due to the increased political and international tensions, specifically in the US and Europe, and due to COVID-19. So these countries have increased regulation to curb Chinese investment, which slows down FDI outflows from China. Furthermore, Beijing has also imposed strict regulation on outbound capital flows in certain sectors, further curbing FDI outflows. So on the other hand, FDI inflows have a good prospect, mostly due to China trying to open up and reform its economy. There have been a number of deregulations over the past few years of FDI inflows through specific legislation, like the Foreign Investment Law, which went into effect on January 1st, 2020. So this deregulatory law, like many others, was an attempt to create increased transparency, equal treatment, and a better and more relaxed environment for foreign investors looking to invest in China. So due to these two reasons, this is why this division got a neutral rating.
So this next division, trade and diplomacy, essentially seeks to analyze the trade and diplomatic dynamics with regard to China, developing economies and developed economies. And it received a moderately optimistic rating, which really just means that it's a tempered optimistic rating. So there's a tempered contribution to a positive FDI forecast. The main problem here has to do with the BRI, another side of the BRI, not the so optimistic one or the positive one. There are plenty of economic inefficiencies with regard to this project. First has to do with costs. So costs are about 30% higher than the official numbers released by the government, meaning that things are more expensive than the government says they are. Second is project placement, meaning that the projects of these mostly transportation-oriented projects, the placement of these are not that strategic, meaning that a lot of them either fall victim to over-congestion, so overuse, or barely no one is using them. So they're not essentially allocating resources to the best extent possible and not efficiently. This has had an impact on relations with the countries that are hosting these projects because the cost has been too high and they're not being used to the best extent. So that is definitely a detraction from the overall positive picture that the BRI, that we depicted at the BRI. But overall, our analysis is that essentially the geopolitical goals that they're achieving, China's achieving, and the countless other economic benefits really do outweigh this one pretty significant con, which is why we still rated this an optimistic division. The other portion here is the United States. So we have the fact that the incoming Biden administration is most likely, or at least there's no evidence to really indicate that they're going to remove the tariffs placed on China by the Trump administration, mostly because they have not admitted to that being a policy goal for them, or the appointed officials really aren't going to be. There's no indication that these appointed officials, like the appointee for Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, are going to push for that kind of policy. So from a policy standpoint, we see that things might not necessarily improve with relations with China, but on a higher level in terms of just conflict resolution and dialogue, we see that things are going to improve because we expect this administration to take a more traditional approach to resolving problems, which means that the general environment is expected to be more conducive to FDI, even if from a policy point of view, things won't necessarily change. So we've concluded, finally at our forecast section, that over the next 2 years, we will see institutional investors play a larger role in China's financial markets and financial services sector. And institutional investors really just refers to organizations or companies or firms making investments. So this breaks down in 3 main points. First is following Jpmorgan's recent acquisition, and this point really just refers to a recent acquisition made by Jpmorgan following Chinese deregulation of laws that essentially prohibited foreign firms owning majority or 100% stake of domestic Chinese financial firms. So following that deregulation, at least 2 additional global asset managers will purchase majority stakes of domestic Chinese financial firms. Second, we see that currently 99.6% of investors in China's financial markets are retail investors, meaning regular people investing their own money. This figure will decrease by at least 1 to 2%, meaning that this is going to be a literal shift from retail-dominated investing in China to more institutional focus or a bigger presence for those sectors. Then we're going to have newly bought Chinese firms partner with tech giants and their subsidiaries to access consumer data in order to establish a customer base. So in terms of the methodology that we use to come to this forecast, both in terms of the text of the forecast itself and how confident we are in it, we essentially employed a qualitative analysis model, which means that we identified a set of variables that are all equally important to essentially determining what the trend or trajectory of a trend is, and this trend being FDI. In our case, these variables were our 5 research divisions. In order to come up with a confidence level in terms of how confident we are in our forecast being positive, 5 out of 5 is the highest confidence and 1 out of 5 is the lowest. As you'll remember, we had a spectrum of optimism that we showed y'all before that we used to rate each division. In each of these ratings receives a numerical value, 1 being the highest for optimism and -1 being the lowest for pessimistic. 3 divisions received a 1 value. The 4th one received a 0, meaning it was neutral, and the 5th division received a 0.5, meaning it was moderately optimistic, which really means that our final confidence level is 3.5 out of 5, or 70% confidence in our forecast. What does this mean? It means that there's significant evidence pointing to the fact that the FDI outlook for China with regard to financial firms is not so bright.
In taking a closer look specifically at these financial firms, there are a number of different developments that have occurred in recent years that have really made this a pretty interesting sector of the Chinese economy to look at. So first of all, we've seen some very important recent regulatory changes. So for one, there were some changes made by Beijing in 2019 that scrapped foreign ownership limits of security and fund firms, as well as life insurance and futures firms in 2020. Or they took effect in 2020, I should say. Foreign insurers are now allowed to hold more than 25% stake in Chinese insurance asset management companies as well. And these regulatory changes, among others, have helped to make this sort of shift to a focus on institutional needs within the financial services industry in China. Additionally, like Mauricio mentioned earlier, we're going to see perhaps an increased emphasis on partnerships with foreign tech giants as a result of FDI regulations being relaxed. So for example, let's say Evan goes to study abroad in China, and a crucial part of surviving in China is WeChat, because you use WeChat to pay for your transportation, you use it to pay for your groceries, you use it to pay for eating and shopping. It's essentially something that you have to use for multiple functions of commerce in daily life in China. And nowadays, we have the increased opportunity for perhaps even American tech giants to pay to access customers' data, including that of people like Evan, which means that foreign tech giants will be bolstered in their ability to data mine by FDI as well. Furthermore, there are some additional benefits for the retirement fund sector that we could see, considering that institutional investing is highly important to retirement funds in the West, and this pattern should continue in China as well, which makes it all the more shrewd of a move by Beijing, considering that China's population is rapidly aging. So all of these combine to give some additional strength and stability to the Chinese financial sector as a whole.
So after our research and analysis, we created an investment recommendation that anyone, including individual investors like you, can follow. We first propose investing in the MSCI China Financials ETF. And an ETF is a basket of securities that you can buy on the stock exchange. So this ETF contains a broad scope of large and successful banks, life insurance firms with asset management wings, and investment banks that are based in China. And we chose this investment because it is the best representative ETF of the Chinese financial services industry, which we know from our research will benefit substantially from FDI inflows. Next, we propose investing in the Jpmorgan China Fund. This mutual fund contains a number of large Chinese tech and financial firms that will benefit from FDI inflows. So we propose investing in this mutual fund because it first tracks the Chinese economy as a whole, which we know is going to benefit from FDI inflows over the next 2 years. And second, it includes the largest tech giants in China, Alibaba and Tencent, which play a major role in the financial services industry through fintech in China. And like Sam mentioned earlier, the partnerships between these domestic giants and foreign companies will benefit financial institutions and the Chinese economy as a whole through increased FDI inflows. Overall, this investment proposal represents a culmination of all of our research and analysis. So investors like you can follow these recommendations and benefit greatly over the next 2 years.
Coming into our research, we initially projected a very optimistic future for FDI in China, considering how much of a role it's played in the Chinese economy over the past 4 decades or so. But we found a lot more nuances as we continued doing our research and making more analysis out of it. For one thing, it's a lot more gray when it comes to trade, regulations, and diplomacy, for sure. But as a whole, we predict a moderately optimistic future for FDI in China. We had a great time putting this together. We're really pumped up by the work that we've managed to accomplish this semester, and we want to thank all of you for coming out today and taking a look at what we have to show for it. So thank you all very much. And yeah, I think that's all from us.
Yeah, feel free to ask any questions, raise your hand in the Zoom chat. Great job, team. That was a fantastic presentation. All right.
Cameron, you have a question?
Yeah, you can call. If you can see I'll call
Yeah,
people. Yeah. Yeah, okay, we have a question from Cameron and Jalil.
Yeah, I saw Cameron first.
I have a couple, and then Jalu has one. We can like alternate with other people in the call who want to ask questions, so we don't have to go all at once. I wanted to quickly ask about the BRI. So y'all gave the BRA like a pretty positive outlook, but somewhere between like a quarter and a third of all BRI projects have failed and have been canceled, and there's a significant amount that have like either become held up in funding or have faced like massive local backlash. Where exactly are you getting positivity on the BRI at the present moment, especially given COVID?
So a few fronts. So first, the main reason we rated it so optimistic was because our focus is not necessarily on problems concerning outflows, because the BRI is the main project in outflows. So essentially money coming out of China to invest in developing economies. So if there's going to be a problem with the BRI that contributes to an overall negative outlook for FDI, generally speaking, it would have to really affect negatively inflows coming in China, and it really doesn't. So one, that means problems with outflows really make up a minor portion of our calculus here. And then second is the fact that we still assess that the BRI achieves grander geopolitical goals, some effective economic and regional integration, and is generally giving China the leverage that it wants. Even if from an economic perspective, there are a considerable degree of failures. All that holistically just means to us that at least in terms of inflows, which is the crux of what we're analyzing, it's still positive for China, or at least it doesn't detract sufficiently. Does that answer it kind of?
We have a thumbs up. Let's go to our next question from Shruti.
Yeah, I was hoping you guys could touch more on the financing aspect, especially since the BRI consists of many different countries with different income and GDP levels. And since it's such a massive and expansive initiative, like how would this impact the debt to GDP ratios of these countries? And like, how would they mitigate that?
So we didn't research how they would plan to mitigate the debt to GDP ratio. We definitely know that these projects that are financing, like the financing of these projects via a lot of loans to these developing economies that are susceptible to having to pay back high interest rate on loans would cause problems for them when that ratio gets up pretty high. And again, our perspective is not necessarily that China's looking out for these developing economies, that their main goal is gaining leverage and really achieving a degree of integration in which these countries are dependent on them. So if we're going to say that these countries will be disadvantaged by a lot of BRI projects because they fail, or because that the GDP ratio is rising because of these financing, or because of involvement in BRI, we don't say it's a problem from China's perspective.
Okay, thank you.
Great, let's go.
Evan has a question.
Let's go to Evan and then end with Jalu.
Great presentation, all of you. So if you guys are keeping up with the news, which I assume you guys are, you guys probably realize that there is a new bill that was just passed by the House of Representatives that forces companies to be held accountable to transparency standards in the United States. I've read a couple of the literature for both sides on why it would increase foreign direct investment in China and why it decrease FDI in China, but what do you guys think? Would you think this bill would help increase or decrease FDI in China, especially from the United States?
Sahana and Sam, do you want to give that one a go?
Sure. Oh, Sahana?
Yeah, go ahead. No, my connection just lagged, so you can go ahead.
Okay. So one thing for sure that I think we can take a look at some of this is that this is part of a broader trend. It's not an isolated incident, that's for sure, of the West starting to take a look more at some of the perceived unfair trade practices and commercial practices that have been used by China in recent years. There have been a lot more controversy. It was part of the Trump administration's rationale for imposing these tariffs that we've seen and trade restrictions in general over the past 4 years or so. And I think that this will somewhat go along with this. We're not sure exactly what the Biden administration's position is going to be on trade tariffs. There's no sign that they're going to be let up, but overall, I think this is probably going to somewhat keep it plateauing, a bit stagnant in terms of the level of FDI inflows and outflows that are coming out, considering that it is going to damage investor confidence as well as imposing more regulations in general. So I think it's going to be more along that sort of status quo where you see a more negative viewpoint from governments and perhaps investors as well in the West when it comes to FDI in China.
Yeah, thumbs up from Evan. Let's go to Jalu.
Yeah, I just have a question real quick about the retail investor number of 99.6%. So you earlier mentioned that the number is going to go down by 1 to 2%, but however, you're just talking about the number of retail investors. So what does that really imply trading volume wise? Because like in the US stock market, even though there are a large number of retail investors, it's only accounting for 30% of the trading volume. So most of the, I guess, market trend and market movement is in charge by hedge funds or big institutional investors. So what does that 1 to 2% really imply, I guess, trading volume wise in comparison to the number of investors actually?
Sana, do you want to give that one a go?
I wasn't the one who
You want me to, I can do it, okay.
I feel like you might have a
Okay, that's okay, yeah, okay. So basically, it's indicating that the role for institutional investors is going to increase. Like you mentioned, that about 30% in the United States of investors in the stock market are retail investors. That's just because institutional investors in the United States play like a major goal, like a major role. Or about a third of investors in the United States are. Sorry, you're
1 second. I was not saying that the number of retail investor accounts only for 30%, but the trading volume. So here, when you mention the number of retail investors, I assume you're talking about like number of people. So what does that really imply trading volume wise, which I think is more important when you look at these numbers personally.
Trading volume just mean that the more of the trading volume is going to come from institutional investors.
Right. So what does that 1 to 2% really look like when it comes to trading volume and the market power?
What do you mean market power?
Trading volume.
Just trading volume? I mean, we expect that trading volume is just gonna, in terms of how much retail investors play a role in trading volume, like the proportion of trading volume made up by retail investors is going to get smaller. Like that's the simple answer. It's just going to get smaller from the retail side.
Okay.
Yeah, great question. That will wrap it up for the China segment. So thank you from the China team. Thank you from everyone who asked a question. Great engagement. All right. Yes, clap in the chat. Clap in the window. Yes, got some claps. Nice. All right, let's go to the Latin America team. I'll introduce Evan.
Oh, are you going to introduce me or are you just going
to? Yeah, Evan, go ahead and introduce the team.
All right. Well, can you give me sharing screen permissions? Well, yes, I think you have. Never mind. Haha. All right. Hello, everybody. What a lovely evening it is. Last day of school. I bet all of you guys are super excited. So start off round 2 of GMT presentations is Latin America's Emerging Economies team, also the premier team for humor and excitement and energy. So you guys are welcome. Our team has 4 members, but one of our members unfortunately could not make it because he had a finance final today. So we will be presenting using with our 3 members, me, myself, Evan Butra, Nikhil, and Gran. You want to introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Grania. I'm a junior fellow with the Latin America's Emerging Economies team.
And hi, I'm Nikhil. I'm also a junior fellow with the Latin America's Emerging Economies team.
Yes, wonderful people here. And in loving spirit of Paul, we will use him throughout the presentation as a character, as you guys will see. So let's kick it off.
Okay, so start with, we're going to clarify what exactly is the informal labor market. So informality is labor not regulated or taxed by the government. In Brazil, this means it's kind of whether you hold a labor card or not. Take, for example, Paul, our unfortunate member who has a finance exam today, is a pear vendor. He sells pears and he goes to his stall and he sells pears. He works in the informal labor market. Evan, on the other hand, is a management consultant and he would be considered a member of the formal labor market. So our research question was, we kind of started out with Brazil's public health crisis. In the past, Brazil has been pretty good at dealing with past health crises, for example, AIDS and the Zika virus. However, they have one of the highest death rates in the world for COVID-19. So the government response to the pandemic has been pretty bad. And so we looked at how we noticed that informal workers in particular have been affected a lot by the pandemic and decided to research further until we got to the specific research question of how will the pandemic affect the size of Brazil's informal market relative to the formal market. So during our research, we noticed that informal work was unstable and dangerous during the pandemic, and a lot of formal workers were also laid off. So we decided to look more into what factors affect the size of these labor markets. Our purpose is to project if informal labor market will decrease or increase, propose policies to decrease the size of the informal sector, because we believe that decreasing the size of the informal labor market would be beneficial.
When we're considering policy proposals regarding Latin America and Brazil's informal market, we're going to be looking towards political, economic, social, and historical factors. On the political sphere, we're going to be looking towards policies that Brazil has instituted in the past in order to decrease the size of the informal market. For example, different labor codes or regulations. On the economic side, we're looking at stabilization policies or regulatory frameworks that Brazil has had specifically looking towards economics. Socially, we're looking at how coronavirus has impacted demographics inside Brazil and what that's going to be doing to where people are wanting to work and what people are actually thinking. Historically, we're going to look towards what Brazil has actually done in the past. By looking towards all four of these areas, we'll be able to come up with an accurate policy proposal and projection for the future.
Thank you, Nikhil, for introducing our framework. Now let's dive deep into our research. The way we're going to divide this is by exploring the four main insights we were able to develop from our framework and from our research, starting with education. Now, education has its roots in economic, social, and historical research, but I'm pretty sure you guys are all familiar with what education is. I mean, you guys are all students at UT Austin, so if you don't know what education is, that's kind of a worry. But to reiterate, regardless of what you think about education or not, it serves as one of the most effective long-term investments for the government, purely because it helps build what is called human capital, right? Human capital is a concept where if you get more educated, you become more skilled, you as a worker will become more productive for the economy, and therefore you'll be able to put more output for the economy, right? Now, in discussion of Brazil and its informality rates, there was a study conducted by Rodrigo Soares and Daniel Hanwickel between 2003 and 2012. And there was a long-term correlation between educated population, an increase in the college-educated population, and a decrease in the informality rates. Now, this is significant because although this is just a correlation, this is nonetheless a long-term one provided by econometric models and provided also supported by economic theory. So this was very significant in that education can lead perhaps to Paul getting out of his pairs. We'll discover that more later, but what you have to understand is before we go lovey-dovey on education, inequality still exists. I'm pretty sure you guys are all familiar with all the inequality that exists in the American educational system, but in Brazil, the inequality is even more persistent in our opinion, because 60% of employees with a university degree are actually women, but educated women earn only 36% less income than their male educated counterparts. Now that's gender inequality. When it comes to racial inequality, Black or mixed race Brazilians are disproportionately represented in underfunded public systems. And what that basically means is that, you have racial and gender disparities in Brazilian educational system. So in order for us to get lovey-dovey about education, we have to try to tackle that somewhat. Now, our second insight is going to be about labor regulation. And labor regulation is a bit different and a bit more nuanced than education. So let me break it down for you guys, right? Labor regulation explicitly is just any law that helps mediate the relationship between employees and employers. So for example, bringing back myself as an example, which I was not the one who came up with the idea, right? It was George. But let's say that I was a management consultant working for a management consulting firm at Brazil, and I decide to strike up a relationship with my employer when I sign my contract. Anything that is mandated by the government, including minimum wages, payroll taxes, benefits, that's all part of what is called labor regulation, right? Laws that help mediate the labor market and dictate how I interact with my employer, the management consulting firm. Tightening these labor regulation is something you will hear often when you talk about labor theory, and that's essentially increasing the amount of regulations that there are, increasing minimum wages, increasing payroll taxes, increasing working hours, implementing work from home laws, etc. Right? So what we found from labor regulation is the more regulation that there is, generally, the higher the correlation with informality rates. That means it's different than education, it's inverse. The more regulation that there is, the more informality rate goes up. And the reason why is because of labor costs, right? If you have a management consulting firm and you decide to impose more laws on it, then they'll have to essentially pay more direct or indirect costs to keep me, the worker, alive, right? And what that leads to is that there's a lot of firing that goes on and a lot of layoffs, as you can see during the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to mitigate costs, firms are firing workers, right? So we'll try to discuss apparent examples of these throughout the presentation, but keep in mind that Brazil has been known to increase or decrease labor regulations in the past, and that will probe the crux of our research.
Another thing we noticed was that during the pandemic, there's been the emergence of a new vulnerable population. This middle income population are people who earn more than the requirements for cash transfer programs, but still have relatively low incomes. Even in normal time, this population wavers in and out of poverty, shifting between informal work and informal work. This group is especially impacted during COVID-19 because they don't qualify for emergency basic income programs. This population is at the highest risk of increasing informality rate in the short term because they're more likely to go back into informality or stay in informality.
And when we're looking at Brazil, one key thing we need to be looking toward is means-tested welfare programs inside Brazil. In Brazil, the main one is Bolsa Familia. And in this welfare program, what's going to be happening is when families earn less than 140 reais per month, and they have certain educational requirements, they're able to actually receive this welfare programs and welfare benefits. However, the key is they need to be making this much money in the formal sector. Once their formal income surpasses a certain amount, that 140 reais, they're not able to receive that income anymore. For example, all the money Paul gets from selling his pears, that doesn't count to whether or not he actually receives Bolsa Familia welfare benefits. However, Evan, in his ideal role as a management consultant, that counts. And if he's making above 140 reais per month, Evan doesn't receive any of these welfare benefits. And that's a very key thing inside Brazil, because in Brazil, we've seen how this is covering 14 million families and giving a lot of payout and reducing poverty rates inside all of Brazil. However, while it is effective in Brazil, Bolsa Familia and welfare programs are also having effects on informality. For instance, Bolsa Familia on one hand means that people are more likely to hold a formal job. When people are receiving cash and social benefits, it allows them to find jobs and stay in the job market and get this training before actually searching for a job, meaning they're more likely to find a job. However, on the other side, people that actually receive welfare benefits are more likely to spend more time in total in the informal market in terms of working hours. And we'll cover why this is happening later. So now we'll be looking at our projection for exactly what we're projecting is going to be happening. In the next 6 months, we project that the informal market in Brazil will increase because of the pandemic. And there's 3 key reasons this will be happening. First is because of welfare programs in Brazil, then because of increasing unemployment, and next because of structural labor regulations. One key reason why informality is going to be increasing in Brazil is because of welfare programs. I talked about earlier how welfare programs in Brazil are causing people to spend more time in the informal market. And we see that every single family that actually receives welfare benefits in Brazil, every person per week spends 10.1 hours more per week in the informal market versus the formal market. They take out their labor from the formal market and they put it in the informal market instead. And this is because they want to receive these benefits. For instance, if Evan in his role is slowly reaching the cliff of like 140 reais per month, once Evan makes more than that amount of money, he won't get these welfare benefits anymore. So instead, Evan might stop working in the formal sector. He might stop actually adding hours in the formal sector and might go join Paul in selling pears. This way, he gets money from selling pears, he gets money from his management consulting role, and he's able to receive welfare benefits at the same time. And we see this is happening on a much larger scale in all of Brazil, something known as the earnings cliff. When people are slowly reaching this certain point of where their welfare is going to be cut off, they actually start shifting the hours worked into the informal market. And that's why every single person in Brazil that receives welfare sees 10 hours extra work per week in the informal market. And once more people are going to be receiving welfare because of coronavirus, and Brazil's government has actually increased stimulus checks specifically for welfare, we're predicting that the informality rate is going to be increasing.
Okay, so this one you guys may be able to relate to because unemployment is something that's been happening everywhere, regardless of the country, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in Brazil, as when I talked about inequality in the educational system, it seems to be even more exaggerated because Brazil's unemployment rate has reached an all-time high with 14% unemployment rate. Its underemployment rate has reached 32.6%. And that just means there's no bueno, right? Now, what does this have to do with informality rate and why is this in our projection in the first place? Well, let's take the example again of me as a management consultant. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, inevitably the management consulting firm that I work for has to fire and lay off some workers, some temporarily and some permanent, right? But me as an employee, if I get laid off, I don't know if I'm being laid off temporarily or permanently. So let's take an example of me being in the United States. If I was working in the United States as in a management consulting firm and I get laid off, well, I might, go for an entrepreneurial project. I might look for a different firm to work at because I've already built my expertise in this industry, the conventional ways. However, here's the stipulation. In Brazil, there's another route you can go down into. You don't necessarily need to stay at home and look for jobs. The other route is going into the informal market, going to the jobs where the government doesn't monitor you and you can earn money on the side while you search for the formal job. So what I could essentially do in Brazil, if I get laid off, I could dial up my buddy Paul. He still has his pear vendor because people still need pears in his local neighborhood, and I could work for him. I could buddy up with him and I could earn passive income that way. And what happens then is that the amount of people that work in the informal market, the informality rate, will inevitably increase as a result of people being laid off in the formal market.
Another key reason why we're saying informality will go up in Brazil is because of labor regulations. Evan talked about earlier about the 1988 Constitution in Brazil. And the 1988 Constitution increased labor regulations and increased entry costs for employees. If a firm, a management consulting firm, finds it more expensive to actually hire Evan, they have to pay Evan more, they have to give Evan paternity leave, they have to give Evan all of these benefits and all of these payments that he might not be receiving before, they might go like, hey, Evan just isn't worth the cost, we're not hiring him anymore. And that's what's happening in Brazil, because recently we've seen a large shift towards increasing labor regulations. For example, just this year, the Brazilian Senate passed a bill, actually increasing labor regulations even more. And as we see even more and more labor regulations, companies are finding it tougher to hire employees. It's making it tougher and increased entry costs for all employees. And that means we're seeing a structural increase in informality. It's not just a cyclical problem. Instead, when we have all these labor regulations, people are structurally going to be placed in the informal market instead.
There are a lot of different opinions about whether a larger informal market is negative or positive, but we believe that it's mostly negative. COVID means bad working conditions and less social distancing. Paul has to physically go and sell his pears. He can't work from home. There's also no stable income, and generally this population doesn't have savings to fall back on. So there's just harsher conditions in general. Also, people can get stuck in the informal market, and informality can lead to stagnant economic growth. Therefore, we believe that we need policies to fix this.
Thank you for mentioning that policy transition. And with that, we will be talking indeed about our policies. So this is where our presentation will differ from the past one, China team and the AI team, which is going to be the next presentation. We have devised some very, very broad directions of policies for which we can take in order to try to mitigate this increase in the informality market. Now, are these policies going to be enacted by Jair Bolsonaro and his administration in Brazil? Most likely not. But it gives an insight towards what possible directions the administration could go in order to try to mitigate the informality rise. Now, our first policy that we recommend is related to this picture. And if you guys are familiar with education at all, this is a graduational setting, right? These are graduated students, and hopefully this will be all of us in a few years when we get our degrees from UT Austin. Well, our first policy is in tandem with this ulterior motive for education. It is to increase cash transfer programs that are conditional with the means test of education. So, for example, if you have a sort of cash transfer program where families are only eligible should they put their kids to school, that would be one example of a means test welfare program conditional on education. If Paul has a kid Paul Jr., the hope is that Paul puts Paul Jr. in school, and we give him money for doing that. We give him money that's additional to the amount of cost that it takes to put Paul Jr. in school. And the hope then is that that becomes Paul Jr. right there, Paul number 2.
Currently, there's been a decrease in support from government for conditional cash transfers and education in general. In May of 2019, President Bolsonaro announced that he would decrease funding for Brazil's federal higher education institutions by 30%. Also, basic education has been severely defunded by $87 million. This is the consequential effect of decreasing social mobility. However, there has been a growth of higher education enrollment. 2.8 million Brazilian students between the ages of 15 and 17 abandon school each year because of financial constraints. So there is a willingness to enroll in higher education, but they need government support through conditional cash transfers for education. We recommend increasing conditional cash transfer in education. For an example of this is Bolsa Familia. Bolsa Familia is a conditional cash transfer program in Brazil that is focused on education. It increased girls' school participation by 8.2 percentage points and increased its overall participation rate by 4.5 percentage points. So Bolsa Familia also reduces dropout rates for both males and females. This means more people are going to school and less people would drop out. This increase in education would give an incentive to shift towards formality because there are more educated workers to work for these formalized firms. So basically, increasing education would increase formalization in labor markets. We recommend emphasizing the educational element of conditional cash transfer programs to address the perverse incentives to stay in the informal market that Nikhil mentioned earlier.
Yes, and if you guys are curious about why that quote is there in the middle, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was the president of Brazil who enacted Bolsa Familia, this very program that Ryan was talking about. Now, on to our second policy. Well, as you can see here, this seems to be a very optimal setting for a job interview, right? You have the people on the right who are interviewing the people on the left, or the person on the left, I should say. Well, what's one way that we could actually try to make people go to the formal labor market? Well, if you guys remember all the way back when, we discussed labor regulation and how that seems to be a barrier to entry for most informal labor markets. So our second policy is to decrease labor regulation. And what that means is that we want to decrease the amount of laws that there are governing the labor markets so that the relationships between employers and employees become more flexible. Now, what that specifically means will be up to the administration who decides to do it, but that could mean like decreasing payroll taxes or making work from home laws more flexible, making working hours more flexible, right? And now the hope here is that Paul could enter the formal market because he does not have that barrier to entry as he did before. And in the future, Paul too can enter the formal market too.
And GMT is proposing, and we think that actually having decreased labor regulations inside Brazil is going to be feasible specifically because of Brazil's government. If you know anything about Brazil's government, you know that Bolsonaro is basically your Latin American version of Trump. He's a populist right-wing leader. And because of this, he's also like in favor of stuff like decreasing labor regulations. That's something that differs from his administration versus past Brazilian leaders. And because of this, it's going to be very, very likely for his government to do something such as decreasing labor regulations and making it easier for businesses to actually operate inside of Brazil.
Now, what will be the effects of decreasing labor regulation, you say? Well, look no more than to history, if history is to be repeated. So the first thing we can look at is the 1988 constitutional change we've mentioned throughout the presentation. And let me just say it again. It is increasing labor regulation in 1988 to amend the labor code. What that resulted, as Nikhil mentioned earlier, is a spike in the informality rate in 1989, a 3% informality rate spike that is correlated to the changes in the labor code. So that's no bueno, right? If we're trying to mitigate the increase in the informality rate. On the other hand, in 2017, there was actually a decrease in labor regulation, and this was made by then President Michael Temer. And it was labor reforms that tried to make sure that the relationships between employers and employees become more flexible. So what actually happened was that there became a decrease in the cost of litigation by 40% for employers. So what that basically boils down to in microeconomics is if there is less regulation for me, the employee, to base my lawsuits off of, then I just make less lawsuits and I make less bases. And my employer, the management consulting firm, has to essentially pay less to settle and for litigation costs in general, right? So that's a good thing generally for pro-business moves. Now, in terms of whether there's ethical standards that correlate with that, obviously there's going to be a discussion on that aspect. But in terms of the informality rate, that'll help decrease the barriers to entry because firms will be more inclined to hire more people as a result of the decreased cost of labor. So in conclusion, we had 4 main insights that we were able to gather from our 4-pronged framework for our question of the informality market in Brazil. And our projection ultimately was that the informality market will increase in the next 6 months because of 3 different reasons: unemployment, means tested welfare, and structural rigidity in the labor market. We devised 2 separate directions for policies that we could go. One of them relatively progressive, a cash transfer program contingent on education, and one of them relatively neoliberal, decreasing labor regulation. Now, our hope is not specifically that Brazil is going to implement every single thing that we say, but is that we have a more grounded understanding as citizens of the world to try to understand the impacts of the labor market in emerging countries in Latin America, as well as how it influences other countries that we live in. So thank you, and it's question time.
Feel free to raise your Zoom hand and ask some questions. But as people are formulating questions, great job to Latin America team. Super easy to understand, and the logic was really clear. Great presentation. Any questions? We have a question from Juan.
Yeah,
hello, Juan.
Evan. Hey, what's up, Evan? I know you brought up the concern of like ethical considerations. I just wanted to know if you could list some examples on specific labor laws that would be debatable on whether you should remove or revoke or even decrease them on ethical like concerns.
Yes. So one of the biggest discussions when it comes to labor reform, especially in the United States, is about the minimum wage, right? Should you increase the minimum wage? Should you decrease the minimum wage? Now, what we would be vying for by decreasing labor regulation is that we would essentially encourage decreasing minimum wages. Now, is that something that we personally recommend? Maybe, maybe not, depends on your economic perspective. But in terms of the informality rate, there have been positive correlations with decreasing labor regulations, such as decreasing minimum wages and decreasing informality rates in general. Now, obviously, you want to know the ethical implications of that. The ethical implications of that is that regulations exist there for a reason, in order to make sure that employers do not exploit employees, especially the ones who basically are unfamiliar with the way that labor markets work and don't know how to conduct themselves in front of employers, right? So that's why these laws exist for a reason, and removing them could provide methods for exploitation by employers. So that is the fear there.
I see Juan nodding. Great. I actually have a question. In the beginning, you guys mentioned a little bit about how COVID is making it harder for informal workers to work because they often have to go out on the streets and it violates social distancing guidelines. So I'm wondering what you think about that force kind of against informal labor versus the forces that you have described going for informal labor.
Nikhil or Garn, you want to take that one?
So, I mean, a lot of the time it's unskilled labor. So, like these people maybe don't have the education to work in the formal labor market, and therefore are just unemployed and just trying to find whatever informal labor they can. And also, like a lot of people are being laid off from the formal labor market, so there's not a lot of opportunities to go into the formal labor market. So it turns into just the unemployment rate increasing rather than people moving out of the informal labor market.
And to corroborate Ranya's statement, yes, George, you bring up an incredible point But the thing is, when people lose their jobs in the formal market, they go to the informal market, or they can stay unemployed. But chances are you want money, right? We all want money. That's somewhat of like a human standard. But if you're in the informal market and you get laid off because of COVID-19 or natural external reasons, it's not as easy for you to transition to the formal market because you're not as skilled as the formal workers are, nor are you as, let's say, conditionally talented or able to join the formal market as other people are. So there provides therein that barrier of entry, and that's why we do believe that the barrier of entry provides bigger directional force for the reverse direction as opposed to your direction. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, taking the broader view. Let's do one more question from William.
Yeah, I just had a question concerning the issue of deregulation. And so, like, throughout your research, was there any specific approach, either through the federal level or the state level, that had greater benefits? And if the issue of deregulation had better effects through the state level, how do you think that changes the relationship between the Brazilian federal government and the state governments in addressing economic conditions and the COVID-19 pandemic?
Great question. So let me go back to the slide that you will refer to. So there were two main policy changes that we were discussing: the 1980 constitutional change, which increased labor regulation. So that one was the reverse of what we were recommending. And the second one is the same direction as we were recommending, is to decrease labor regulation, deregulation, the 2017 labor reform. Now that one is more of a federal as opposed to a statewide or state-based regulation. So in terms of state-based regulations, that might be more specific and it might be a bit off tangent to the research that we conducted. But for the federal level, as I said, the consequences mostly were reaped through lesser litigation costs. And if you know anything about just labor markets in general, litigation costs with employee and employee relationships can make up a large sum of the total cost of labor. So having a way to mitigate those costs of labor for firms will be very great in order to ensure that these firms will continue hiring more people. Otherwise, if they get sucked into this vortex of paying for litigation costs, they'll effectively be unable to spend more on hiring more workers because they'll be paying more for these litigation costs. Does that make sense?
Yep, thanks.
Fantastic. Well, great job, Latin America team. Let's now transition to the next and final presentation. Last but not least, the artificial intelligence team led by Sanchit. Sanchit, will you introduce your team?
Yeah, thank you, George. So yeah, we're the AI team. I'm Sanchit, the senior fellow of the AI team.
I'm Brian. I'm a junior research fellow for the AI team.
I'm Niharika. I'm a junior research fellow.
I'm Juan. I'm also a junior research fellow.
I'm Faison, and I'm also a junior research fellow.
I'm Himani, and I'm a mentor for the team.
Awesome. So I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can get started.
So hello, we've already introduced ourselves. This is our GMT capstone presentation and project presentation for the AI and automation team. So first, this is our introduction / forecasting question. We already did the intro, and just a quote I want you guys to keep in mind throughout the presentation is by Jeannie Romiti. Some people call this artificial intelligence, but the reality is this technology will enhance us. So instead of artificial intelligence, I think will augment our intelligence. Right off the bat, our forecasting question is, which companies within the sectors of biotech, pharmaceuticals, and finance will see the most growth in the form of stock returns due to the rise of AI and automation within the next 5 years? But why this question, you may ask? Well, here are some big picture problems in AI. But first off, this is what AI is. It is a branch of computer science concerned with building smart machines used to perform tasks usually done by humans with the goal of replicating or simulating human intelligence in machines. So there are many promising things about AI, but there are two issues we wanted to focus on for this project. And the first is loss of jobs due to the growth of AI and stock market prosperity. And specifically, who the people are most affected, or the people most affected by these problems, which are low-income families and individuals. Although loss of jobs is happening in every sector and field, high and low end, integrating AI is predominantly replacing jobs previously occupied by low-income individuals, such as like labor jobs. And second, the second problem also disadvantages low-income individuals. Studies show that prospering stock market, in essence, makes the rich richer, increasing the wage gap between people. So what was our solution? Our solution was to make an ETF. In short, an exchange traded fund is a bundle of stocks you can buy at a fraction of the price through a brokerage firm, to be explained later further. And our reasoning for choosing an ETF for a project: one, it directly combats the problem. It makes investment more accessible to everyone, meaning we can directly combat the problem we have. It is quantifiable. We can measure whether our project was successful or not within the next 5 years. It gives us a hard measure for research as well. And it's also encompasses an interest of all of us, from ethics to finance to just AI in general. So moving on.
Yeah, so just as Juan introduced, we decided to pursue an ETF, and instead of kind of similar to the China team investing in an ETF, we decided to create our own. Of course, we could theoretically invest in this as well, but our intention was that the general population in the US, as well as just throughout the world, would use this as an opportunity to realize high gains through the growth of AI. But like Juan mentioned, just a very high-level overview, ETF, basket of different stocks. Instead of purchasing each individual stock of a certain company, you're able to purchase ownership of a certain fund that does that kind of investing for you. And the reason we decided on an ETF, at least from a financial perspective, was because it is comparatively low risk and low reward compared to regular investments, as you see in the diagram to the right. And when we were looking for an investment portfolio that a lot of people could engage with, although it would have to be one that definitely is low reward, that will also mitigate a lot of the risk. So that's why we decided on an ETF. So this is the ETF that we created. It's the Global Macro Health and Finance AI ETF. On the top half, you'll see some details if you're into that for the ETF itself. And on the bottom half, you'll see the various distributions in the stocks and companies we decided to invest in, as well as the 3 different industries that we mentioned in our forecasting question. The percentages, the black percentages on the left are the relative percentages per industry, and the red percentage on the right is the percentage makeup within the entire ETF itself. And if you have any questions about each individual company, we did do due diligence for all these companies, so feel free to ask during the Q&A if you have any inquiries about any specific companies. Here are some more details about the ETF itself, but I just wanted to quickly mention that the way that we decided these companies were there were 2 primary ways. The first, we wanted to make sure that these companies had a history of extensive AI integration into their products, as well as their services and any business operations that they had. In order for a company to effectively utilize AI to grow in the future, we wanted to make sure that they had that necessary infrastructure to grow. And the second was we wanted to see initiatives being taken in the AI direction, where the new technologies that were being introduced weren't necessarily just things to boost during the short term, but were things that the companies could build off in the long term and become the best in the market, the top of their industry.
Yeah, so Brian explained all the companies we include in our ETF, but I guess you're probably wondering how we went about choosing each company and what the research went into each company. So for that, I'll explain the framework behind our research. So in our team's previous weeks, we identified, as mentioned earlier, 3 major industries in which AI has a big foothold today, and it will be into the future. These industries would be biotech, pharmaceuticals, and financial services. After further research, we actually combined the biotech and pharmaceuticals industry because there's a lot of overlap in the companies and what they do. They like, for example, in drug development. In terms of financial services, a lot of companies in that industry are using AI to help businesses maximize returns and analyze consumer data. So after picking these companies and analyzing the work they do, we realized that these companies' work reflected three major trends overall in artificial intelligence. And these three trends are drug development and drug research and development, machine learning and like robotics, disease prognosis and drug trials, and how companies use AI to analyze patterns and risk in data. So essentially, we took our 11 companies and we placed it into one of these three trends to help explain that companies work in today and into the future. And as Brian said, the company has to have solid history of investing in AI technology now and into the future for it to be considered. So I'll start off and describe the first trend, which is drug research and development. But before we go into it, let me just discuss a little history behind the whole trend itself. So back around like 2010, drug development was in a decline. There wasn't many companies investing in it as there was today. But that changed in 2014 when AI technology really ramped up and it stimulated a lot of growth in this field. But why is AI helping drug development? So you might be wondering that. Well, there's two big reasons to that. The first one is if you feed in like an AI algorithm, like thousands or like even millions of sources of data, it can find a lot of deep connections between that data, like really subtle connections that even like researchers like doing manually just can't find. In addition, AI also increases the efficiency of drug development. It makes it a lot faster, it makes it cheaper. And those are two benefits that every company wants to see. So as I said, I think I didn't mention this, but we put 6 companies into this trend of drug research and development. But I'm going to highlight one, Johnson & Johnson, as sort of a case study and to say why we placed in this trend and why we invested in our ETF. So specifically, I want to look at, it's a subsidiary called Janssen, and this is just a drug research company. They've been looking at drug development for over like 40 years now. And more recently, they've been looking at AI in their drug development specifically. But what they're doing special is they're uniquely using their AI to develop an algorithm where they could reuse results from one experiment into future experiments that they do. So essentially, they don't have to start off at square one every single time. They're already 10 steps ahead every time they start an experiment to find, let's say, a drug or like a vaccine. And this saves Johnson & Johnson and Janssen a lot of time and money. And that's a lot of pluses for the company. So on top of Johnson & Johnson's use of AI in drug development, we found a few of the reasons to why it's such a secure company to invest in. First of all, it's a pretty big company. It's a Fortune 500 company. It has a large foothold in biotech and pharmaceuticals. And just having that large foothold and leverage is pretty helpful when making a solid investment. But more specifically, what Johnson & Johnson is special is not only does it put all its eggs in one basket, it doesn't put all its AI in drug development, it leverages it to multiple different fields. So for example, it's investing AI in robotizing surgery. It's investing AI in like identifying Alzheimer's disease, for example, and even uses AI to like monitor baby health and making sure a child is functioning well from day to day. So by leveraging artificial intelligence in these various fields, even if one field does fail, this diversification allows the company as a whole to succeed. And that's what we found is such a solid investment. Now moving on to the next trend, Niharika can take it away.
Okay, so I just want to mention the biggest advantage man has over AI. So man's ability to do causal thinking and connect two completely unrelated events and later find out that they are related is one of our biggest strong points that AI hasn't yet developed yet. But the knowledge graphs, which is the first point, these are vast networks of accumulated scientific data, such as gene sequences, protein, diseases, chemical compounds in this case, to identify potential drug targets and forge connections that are unseen to the human eye. So the knowledge graphs help AI do causal thinking and get one step ahead of us, pretty much. So as Juan said in the beginning, this gives AI to imitate it gives AI context to imitate causal thinking by connecting data from multiple sources and come to one single conclusion. So the next point is target identification. This is a little bit more biological in nature, and basically it zeroes in on the direct molecule, whether it be a gene, protein, or a nucleotide that is causing a disease, and it helps zero in on that target and modify a compound to help combat the disease. Last, we have ML-based hardware and software programs to congregate data more efficiently. And yeah, so we have 3 cases for the ML-based hardware and software to help congregate data more efficiently. The first one is on the left. It is in Silico's Pandomics platform, and this basically helps assemble publication data on a gene. This includes patents, news, publications, journals, articles that other scientists have written, and it allows a group of scientists to access this mass amount of data. In the middle, you see Deep Matter's digital glassware. This is a bit more complicated because it uses sensors and other software to record extensive amounts of experimental data and share it with other scientists in real time. And it basically allows scientists to record their experiments and upload it to a cloud that is shared between everyone who's involved in the company or that project. And last, we have Novartis's NerveLive that's on the right, and it combines data on clinical trial operations from multiple internal sources and systems, and it applies machine learning and advanced analytics to predict and monitor trial enrollment, cost, and quality. So you can see the underlying theme within all 3 of these programs is basically, it's a data company that congregates data into one cloud platform for various scientists to use. So rather than focusing on the actual science or the biology behind these companies, it helps make a more collaborative and efficient environment for scientists to actually work in. And that comes back to the knowledge graphs and causal thinking idea that I was talking about in the beginning. It basically helps AI to imitate humans' ability to think causally, and it helps scientists scientists work in a more collaborative environment.
And so as we move to our final trend, specifically in the sectors of business and finance, we find that a rise in available data streams allows AI to find patterns and analyze risk in all sorts of data. And so our first lens for looking at this is Remark Holdings, but specifically one of their portfolio companies called CanCan AI. So CanCan AI is an AI-based solutions business for banks, financial services, and all sorts of different businesses. And so CanCan consists of 2, I guess, segmented services. And the first is financial risk analysis. And so the most practical example of this is quite recently, we've seen a lot of loan defaults, meaning that borrowers haven't been able to pay back their loans to their banks. And so now looking forward, a lot of these banks are strapped for cash. And so they have to be very prudent and cautious in who they offer loans to. They want borrowers who can end up paying back their loan. So what CanCan provides is a system for when people like George, for example, apply for a loan, they can use AI and machine learning to determine whether George would be a good candidate that would pay back his loan. And then secondly, we transition more to the, I guess, sphere of retail and just overall business. And so CanCan provides a lot of AI-based solutions to track how consumers behave on websites and in person. And so as the, I guess, shopping environment has shifted digitally, we've seen a lot more available data and thus a lot more opportunities to make predictions and decisions as to how to operate businesses. And so next we move to the, I guess, idea of asset management and its connection with AI, and we study it through BlackRock. So BlackRock is a pretty big firm. They do a lot of things from private equity, regular asset management, and they also create their own ETFs. But we look at BlackRock overall, and I guess 2 main aspects of the company. The first is its Aladdin Engine. So the Aladdin Engine is a platform used by portfolio managers, both BlackRock and other institutions, that allow investment professionals to analyze risk, volatility, and other important aspects of their portfolios. And then secondly, BlackRock heavily uses AI and math-based models. And so these models are really important because they can identify patterns that humans can't see, providing exposure to returns. They can analyze macroeconomic metrics like GDP and unemployment to make safe investment decisions, and they can also gauge investor sentiment, which is essentially how investors across markets feel about a certain company or the market overall. And lastly, in terms of short-term trading operations, they can optimize efficiency so that they can decrease latency, cost, and impacts of trades on markets. And so overall, as far as our projection goes, we decide to compare our ETF to the S&P's software and services ETF. And so this is really just a general technology ETF. You may be asking, why did we choose this over the general S&P 500 for a benchmark comparison? And so a lot of these companies that we studied are really linked to, I guess, technology. And so technology-based companies tend to perform differently than the market overall. So it's important that we have an overall technology benchmark when comparing our ETF. And so why do we think our I guess, portfolio stocks should outperform? Demand in the market for AI services will continue to expand due to increased possible use cases and available streams of data. And so companies within this ETF should also experience an increase of their market share within each of their industries. There are some risks that may be involved with this. One of them is unsustainable revenues. The COVID pandemic has resulted in a large wave of digitization. And so once a lot of in-person activities resume, these revenues that were earned during these highly digital periods may not be sustained. This may lead to a collapse of valuations of a lot of tech companies. And so risks like these are important to consider when projecting the performance of the ETF.
So just to recap, AI in pharmaceuticals, biotechnology, finance, and practically every other field is growing in and growing in abundance. And this is a fact, and this trend will continue to occur. And this ETF is meant to capitalize on this trend, where returns are almost guaranteed in this transitional phase for humanity. The only downfall for this trend, as mentioned previously, is who it disadvantages the most. And by creating this ETF, we combat these two trends caused directly from the growth of AI, creating a potentially zero-sum game that does not disadvantage working people as a byproduct of advancements in AI. If effective, which given our extensive research is likely, this ETF could combat one of the major criticisms against further AI development, effectively allowing AI to prosper even further. Thank you. Do you have any questions, comments, concerns?
Who has the first question? All right, let's go with Mauricio. Mauricio, first question.
Can someone actually explain and go back and explain what the black and red percentages were again in the ETF breakdown? Because I remember it represents the percentage of industry that each firm represents, something like that. I can't recall exactly what they meant.
Yeah, sure. So sorry if I went too fast on it, but the green parts there, the percentage there is the distribution. It was a $100,000 ETF that we decided to create. And so each industry got $33,000, or around 33%. And then out of those $33,000, the black percentage is how much each company in our portfolio got from that 33,000. And the red percentage is the overall percentage, so that how much that company makes up out of the entire $100,000 net asset value for our ETF.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Yep.
Our next question comes from Evan.
Okay, good job going through this slide, because I wanted to refer to this slide too. So this is just out of curiosity, right? But did you guys take into consideration the big overall business movement for big retailers like Amazon and Walmart overtaking the pharmaceutical industry in consideration of your ETF in the pharmaceutical industry sector? I would intuitively think that these are the firms that would have the best technological capability to develop these technological advancements that would, be in the future.
So pharmaceuticals was actually my area of research, so I'll take that question. You mentioned Amazon. That wasn't even one of the companies that came across my mind, because you see the companies listed there like Novartis, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson. These were the biggest companies in the pharmaceuticals industry that actively used AI. And the companies that I mentioned in my part of the presentation, they actively created these AI platforms specifically to solve problems. I didn't really see any of that in Amazon or any of those bigger name companies. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and also Evan, like this is also like the ETF just presents like a snapshot of a small group of companies per se. It's not necessarily all the possible solutions. So there are definitely like other companies also or big players in the pharmaceutical biotech industry. These are just a few that we thought were pretty powerful and pivotal in the industry.
Yeah, I have a question. You guys mentioned a little bit about how AI is possibly going to increase inequality and how this ETF is like one possible way for people disadvantaged to be able to, capitalize on the gain as well. Could you go a little bit more into what that specifically means and how you came up with the idea?
Yeah, so the thing with like AI in recent years is that it's a lot of people predicted to take away the like more lower skilled jobs, right? Because that's expected to be automated to machines. And a large proportion of the population, at least for the short term, will be out of work for a little bit. Obviously, that's a really large scale problem. And like since we took an investment approach, it might not be, we couldn't think of a way to solve that. But by an ETF, our idea behind the ETF was to allow investment to open up to a broader group of people. Investing in companies just investing straight up in a company is sort of expensive. An ETF makes it more feasible for a greater population to invest in, so even they could benefit off the growth of AI and artificial intelligence in these various industries. That was kind of the mindset behind the ETF.
That makes sense. It's great. Seems like there are no more questions for the AI team. That was a great presentation. Really easy to follow the logic and great job synthesizing semester's worth of research into something everyone can easily understand. So great job. And with that, we conclude the final presentation night for Global Macro team. Great job to the teams. And thank you so much for, yeah, clap, clap, clap. Thank you so much for everyone who came, who's outside of the org. We hope you enjoyed listening to what we had to say. Is Peyton, Cameron, Jalu, Justin, Chloe, Keshav, Lucy, Shruti. Some people left. But yeah. Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming. And quick plug. If you're interested in joining GMT, we are recruiting for the spring semester. So be on the lookout for that, texasgmt.org. Follow our Instagram at texasgmt. Juan is already starting to market, so good job, Juan. Great job promoting. All right, that is it. So that's our meeting, and let's have members stay on for a little bit just to have a little debrief, but thank you for everyone. Bye-bye. Unmute and say bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks for coming.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Good job, guys. Good job. Very nice. Very nice. Unmute. Give yourselves a round of applause. Everyone, unmute. Round of applause.
Yay.
Yay.
Guys, okay, so I was saying this to my team, right? But like our reports look sexy as fuck, like as if we were an actual think tank, which we basically are now since we're a nonprofit, We are an official nonprofit, so we got to put out as if we are that credible nonprofit, and we did do that with the report, and the presentations just kicked it home, So that's all good. That's all good. Good semester.
So what I'm hearing is GMT can be used as a tax shelter now.
Wait, what'd you say?
GMT can be used as a shelter for, I guess, evading taxes, right? Since we're registered.
Oh, yes.
Yes, 100%. We'll take any charitable donations.
Oh,
very nice.
Donations.
Yeah.
Nice,
You
dude.
want to do concluding speech, George? End of semester.
Concluding speech?
Wait, Evan, is the man bun a permanent thing now? Can I know?
I mean, sometimes I
ponytail
have
or
it,
a bun?
sometimes I don't. It's all like on the flow, right? What I feel.
Also, are you wearing pants too? Like, or is it just a dress shirt?
Bruh, who's wearing pants?
I'm not wearing pants. You're not wearing
pants. Come on now. You're gonna
Well, I'm wearing shorts.
Yeah, I'm wearing joggers,
pants.
bro.
That's not pants. Nah. George, I want to hear your end of your speech. End of your speech.
Okay. I did not prepare an end of year speech, but
What?
what? Surprise! Oh my gosh! But guys, actually, I know all of us, we had a little like practice session, but this was absolutely blew me away. I'm sure blew the audience away. I don't know what expectation the audience had, right? Based on expectations, blew me away 100%. The like quantity of things that we talked about over the semester and having all that background and then being able to synthesize all of that into something where you have a, you know, George has low expectations thing. But we had a clear formulation of either a policy or investment proposal that really stemmed directly from what we learned about each of the fields. So that I think is really impressive. Everyone give yourself a pat on the back. Yes, sir. We did it. We did it. Great job. And I do want to say, this is GMT's what? First anniversary.
Yes.
Burgeoning org. Let's take this org to greater and greater heights.
Are you gonna give me an anniversary kiss, George?
An outing, I see. An outing.
Outing.
Outing indeed.
Outing. Yes. Something continues. Yes. What do we have planned for the spring? It's a good question. I don't know if any of y'all actually had the question, but I'm gonna pretend y'all have it.
I had that question.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you. Simping.
We're gonna be a local macro team now.
Yeah, Sunshine had the question too. The admin team has been planning a forecasting curriculum. So we're going to change it up a little bit. We're going to have a little bit of different projects. We don't have all the details, you know, hammered out perfectly, but we're going to have a little bit different style of a semester next semester. So be looking forward to that. It's going to be fun. I wish we could have some kind of social to end off the semester. I don't know if y'all have to go or who has to go? Who?
Wait, we can also plan it to like next week or something, like over break.
Yeah, I have to go right now. Don't
disappoint finals, George.
Okay. Let's plan it. Yeah, let's plan an end of year because we don't want the semester end with this we're all dressed in formal clothing. I'm sorry. But yeah, let's have a good social, maybe some drinks.
Hey, I'll take initiative. I'll organize.
Yes.
Wow, thank you, Evan.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Good job. Let's tradition, okay? Tradition never fails. Let's take a picture and bye. All right, ready? What are we doing? What are we doing today? Peace. Peace. Please, long. Yeah, peace. Okay. Whatever you want to do. All right. 3. Oh, sorry. 3, 2, 1. Cheese. All right. Thank y'all. I mean, say bye.
Adios.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.